Ever feel like you just hit the reset button? Like you just, yayo and UW, a fresh start would be amazing, but there's all this baggage, this weight holding you back.
Mm-hmm.
Today's deep dive is all about how Christianity tackles that very feeling through the idea of salvation. Now, even if you're not religious, stick around. The concepts we're unpacking get at something universally human, that yearning for a clean slate and a fresh start.
Yeah,
We're working with a really focused breakdown on Christian salvation someone sent in. Should be interesting.
absolutely. And what's fascinating is how this source dives right into the thick of it, starting with this concept of sin.
Okay, before anyone breaks into a cold sweat thinking about that last parking space they stole,
Hmm.
it's worth pointing out that we're not just talking about breaking rules here.
Right.
The source emphasizes that in Christianity, sin is less about specific actions and more about this profound separation from God.
It's like that classic image of a chasm, this immense gulf that's opened up between humanity and the divine. And that's where sin comes in. It widens that chasm, making a true connection and relationship with God impossible.
So it's not just about being naughty or nice, it's about this fundamental disconnect that happened way back in the Garden of Eden, right?
Right here.
Speaking of which, that story always seemed a bit allegorical to me.
And you're right to think that. Whether you take the Garden of Eden literally or see it as a powerful metaphor, the core message resonates. Humanity chose its own will, its own understanding of right and wrong over God's. And that choice, that assertion of self over divine guidance, is where sin takes root.
So we've got this sin problem, this separation, which honestly doesn't sound like a great starting point for humanity.
Yeah.
But then the source takes this turn, talking about God's rescue mission.
And it is a rescue mission of epic proportions, because here's the thing. Despite this whole humanity messed up big time situation, Christianity paints a picture of a God who isn't sitting back in judgment, tapping his foot impatiently.
No angry beard stroking.
Instead, the source emphasizes that God's defining characteristic is love, a love so powerful, so relentless, that he orchestrates this incredible plan to bridge the chasm created by sin.
And this is where, to use the technical term, things get interesting, because the bridge over this chasm, it isn't some cosmic construction project, it's a person.
Exactly. This is where Jesus enters the story. And to call him simply a person just doesn't do justice to the pivotal role he plays in the Christian understanding of salvation.
Yeah, calling him a person in this context is like calling the Grand Canyon a ditch.
Precisely. He's not just a wise teacher or a prophet. He's God incarnate, God himself, stepping into human history.
Okay, now that is a claim I have questions about. But before we unpack that whole God becoming human thing, I think it's important to understand why Jesus is considered so central to this idea of salvation. What did he actually do that makes him more than just another historical figure? This source seems to emphasize his death, but what's so significant about that?
That's where the concept of atonement comes in. You see, it's not that God was up there, tallying up sins, waiting to rain down punishment until anyone stepped up to take the fall. That's not the picture of God this source is painting at all.
Okay, so then what is the picture? Because I've got to be honest, the whole someone had to die to fix things idea has always been a tough one for me to wrap my head around.
And it should be tough. It's a concept full of mystery and depth. But what this source highlights is the idea that Jesus' death wasn't just about punishment. It was about absorbing the consequences of that separation we talked about taking on the weight of humanity's brokenness, our pain, our selfishness, our mortality, everything that separates us from God, and overcoming it.
So it's less about appeasement and more about conquering, like taking on the full force of that chasm and somehow bridging it from the inside out.
Exactly. And that's where the resurrection becomes absolutely crucial. It's the proof, the evidence that death and sin don't get the final word. Jesus' resurrection is this moment of ultimate victory, and it's a victory he then makes available to everyone who chooses to follow him.
Okay, now there's that word again, choose. This source keeps emphasizing that salvation isn't something forced on anyone. It's offered as a gift, but it requires a response. It talks about this idea of faith, which I think is often misunderstood. Some people hear faith and think blind acceptance, checking your brain at the door. Is that really what's going on here?
That's such a critical point. Blind faith is not what the source is advocating for. Instead, it's describing faith as this deeply personal trust, a confident surrender to who Jesus is and what he accomplished. It's like saying, I trust you so completely, I'm willing to build my life on your teachings, on your example.
So it's not about just mentally agreeing with a set of doctrines. It's about a lived-out trust that actually changes how you move through the world.
Precisely. And that change, that ongoing transformation, is where the idea of grace becomes central. Because here's the thing, and this is where things get really radical. Christianity says that no matter how hard we try, no matter how good we manage to be, we can never earn our way back to God. We can never bridge that chasm on our own. That's where grace swoops in.
Yep. So wait, are you saying all those gold stars I earned in Sunday school were for nothing?
I wouldn't say nothing, but you're getting at a key point. This source is saying that salvation isn't a reward for good behavior. It's a pure gift, motivated by God's immense love for humanity. It's like that moment when you realize you could be striving and performing and trying to prove your worth, but then someone just gives you what you could never earn.
Okay, I see what you mean about grace being a radical idea. It's like it completely flips the script on how we normally think about earning approval or worthiness.
Yeah.
But then that leads to another question. If salvation is a free gift, not something you earn, then what motivates people to change? If you're already forgiven, already accepted, what's the impetus to actually become, better?
That's where sanctification comes in. This source explains that justification, that initial moment of being made right with God, is just the beginning. It's like being welcomed into this incredible, life-altering relationship with God, but then the real adventure begins.
So it's not game over, you win. It's like level 1 complete, prepare for an epic journey of transformation.
Exactly. And the source points out that this journey of sanctification is powered by the Holy Spirit, this unseen force that guides, encourages, and empowers believers to become more like Jesus.
Which, if we're being honest, can be a lifelong process full of fits and starts, right?
Right.
And we were talking about fundamentally changing how we think, act, and see the world.
Absolutely. It's not about achieving perfection overnight. It's about taking those baby steps, those stumbling steps even, toward reflecting God's love and grace in our own lives. And that transformation, the source suggests, has implications not just for individuals, but for the world around them.
So we've got this idea of sin creating separation, God's love initiating this rescue mission through Jesus, grace being this unearned gift that makes us right with God, and then sanctification, this journey of becoming more Christ-like. There's one more piece of the puzzle this source touches on, and it's a big one. What happens after we die? What does this whole salvation thing have to say about the afterlife? So we've covered a lot of ground here, Sin. God's love, Jesus, grace, transformation, this whole idea of sanctification being an ongoing journey. But we haven't really touched on what this all means in light of, well, eternity. What does this source say about what happens after we die? Is it all harps and clouds like some people imagine?
It's interesting you mention harps and clouds, because what this source emphasizes is something far more profound, far more experiential than just a change in scenery. It's not so much about going to heaven as it is about experiencing the fullness of God's presence, something that Christianity argues we only get glimpses of in this life.
Okay, so less about pearly gates and more about this idea of finally bridging that chasm completely, like being in total unbroken communion with God.
Precisely. And not just with God, but with each other as well. The source describes it as this state of perfect unity, perfect love, where all the brokenness and pain of this life is healed and redeemed. And it points to a really interesting theological concept here.
Hit me with it.
This idea of the resurrection of the body. It's not just that our souls float off to some ethereal realm while our bodies decompose here on earth. The source points to this belief that when Christ returns, as Christians believe he will, we will be given new glorified bodies, free from decay and suffering, perfectly equipped to experience the fullness of life in God's presence.
Wow, that's a lot to wrap my head around. A total transformation, not just spiritually, but physically as well. Kind of makes those futuristic sci-fi movies pale in comparison, doesn't it?
It really does, but I think what's so compelling about this vision of the afterlife, whether or not you subscribe to its specifics, is that it speaks to a deep human longing for wholeness, for restoration, for a reality where love and justice and beauty reign supreme.
It's definitely a powerful image to reflect on. Okay, so we've unpacked a lot about this idea of salvation, from the initial separation of sin to this incredible vision of restoration and wholeness in the afterlife. If our listener is anything like me, their brain is probably doing backflips right now trying to process it all.
And rightfully so. These are big, complex ideas with profound implications.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what would you say is the most important thing for our listener to take away from all of this?
I think the key takeaway, regardless of one's personal beliefs, is that the Christian concept of salvation forces us to confront the big questions. What is our purpose? What happens after we die? Is there something more to life than what we can see and touch? These are questions that have echoed throughout human history, and whether you find answers in religion, philosophy, or your own lived experience, the search itself is deeply meaningful.
I love that. It's like this deep dive has given us a new lens through which to view not just Christianity, but our own personal journeys as well. Because whether we use the word salvation or not, I think we're all searching for that sense of wholeness, of purpose, of rightness.
Beautifully put. And that search, that yearning, that's something worth exploring regardless of where you land on the specifics of Christian theology.
Absolutely. And on that note, we'll leave you with this. What does your own salvation story look like? What are you striving for? What brings you hope, meaning, and a sense of belonging in this wild ride we call life? Until next time, keep those fascinating questions coming and keep diving deep.